Very good evening to all our viewers and good morning as well for the US viewers. Thank you everyone for joining in today for an intellectual session with Professor Bruce Cahan. He's a very distinguished professor and scholar at Stanford's Human Sciences and Technologies Advanced Research Institute Media X program. He's also an Ashoka Fellow through Urban Logic. He's a lecturer presently in the Management Science and Engineering Department and the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design. He has completed his Bachelor of Science in University of Pennsylvania, Wharton School Economics and International Business, Juris Doctor, Temple University School of Law. So he's a lawyer, he's a professor, he's an engineer, and lately, when I met him at Stanford, I learned that he gave a talk in the Pentagon and the White House, and we are very excited to hear from him about all his experiences of life and, of course, sustainable finance. Welcome, sir. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Harsha. Let me just correct a few things. I am a lecturer at Stanford, not a professor, not a tenured professor. I am a lawyer and not an engineer, but I do try to keep the engineers on the right path at Stanford.
Yes, indeed, indeed. So you have traveled many paths, law, economics, technology, and sustainability. Please describe your journey. What are the momentous achievements along the journey?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me and thanks for convening this. Thanks for coming to Stanford. It was wonderful to have you on campus last week. I do have a neuromuscular condition called dystonia, which I've had since age 8, so my head will shake. But as I like to explain to people as a lawyer in California, New York, and Pennsylvania, if I disagree with you, you'll know it. So don't be confused. Look, I think when you get to a ripe age, after a few decades, you will have traveled many paths and you will pivot. And so that's the case with me. I was born and raised in Philadelphia. Obviously, went to school in Philadelphia, and now and then worked as a corporate finance and government finance lawyer in New York, and now teach finance and ethics at Stanford, among other things. Being open to pivot is a good thing. Most of my pivots came from, let us say, extreme events. I was in New York City, and Con Edison, the utility there, exploded a steam pipe in 1989 outside my apartment building and sprayed 220 pounds of asbestos and killed 3 people, including a young mom in my building. That led me to wonder, well, why do streets in a city like New York City explode? What could we do to make it safer? And I got into geographic information systems early in the 90s and decided New York City needed a base map, a digital map of itself, and multiple layers. And I was not a geographer. I was not a computer science. I had played with computers at Wharton, but I decided this was necessary. But I also saw that people who were geographers, who were computer scientists, didn't know how to argue for the money it would take to build such a map. And it took $100 million, and because I had been a bond lawyer, I was able to argue successfully to the city's budget office to appropriate that. That happened with some regularity. That event led me to be at the command center after 9/11, after the World Trade Center attacks by the terrorists then, and and I learned a lot from that lesson because until you're in an extreme event, you don't necessarily see how everything converges. But in the reaction to an extreme event, most societies will come together and in ways that are phenomenal. because they have to. I wish it didn't take extreme events to make that happen, whether it's natural or man-made disaster. But it's truth, and so things that you wouldn't have permission in a city like New York to do because of the bureaucracy, because of the politics. Once there's an extreme event, those rules of you have to ask someone else permission to do the right thing, those change. And we can leverage that. Oh, you're on mute. Yeah.
Yes, yes, indeed. And it's quite an interesting journey that you've had, and the way you pivoted the career as well as shaped the world along the way. Ashoka made you a fellow for innovative finance. Would you like to share how you are going about organizing your sustainable resiliency trademark bank? And would you like to share a little more about the trademark that you've achieved?
Sure. So this is a complex question, so I'll take it in a few parts. Yes, sustainable resiliency is trademarked by my nonprofit Urban Logic because we don't want it to be used in a way that doesn't bespeak what we mean by it. When I was at the command center after 9/11 and I saw how so many facets of a city interact, how they're interdependent, how the transportation and the water quality and the air quality all interact. I also saw that the terrorists, obviously I'm thinking about what's going on in Israel right now. As a Jewish person, I feel for that. When you see a situation that terrorists have propagated again and again, 9/11 was only the one that we know about, but there were other terrorist incidents at World Trade Center. I wondered, well, what could I do so that these kind of events don't happen with any ever? And that if I wanted Homeland Security for my sons, I have twin sons, Jacob and Eli, who were 9 years old then. If I wanted Homeland Security for them in New York City, I needed, in effect, to have Homeland Security everywhere in the world to tamp down the temptation to see terrorism as an option, which it should never be an option. And so, because I have this finance and economics training and law training, I thought, well, what if we have a periodic table of quality of life elements, QOLs? And people will say, well, Bruce, you know about the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN and other things with ESG. I say yes. But this table would be derived from how governments spend their money, their budgets. And typically, if you look at the balance sheet for a government, any government, Goa, New York City, California, you'll see labels for how they spend the money. They spend it on health, they spend it on environment, they spend it on education, they spend it on public safety. And they do that based on KPIs, key performance indicators, that say if we don't spend the money on health, people will not stay healthy. If we don't spend it on environment, the water and the air will not be clean. So using, in effect, the production curves of these KPIs, I could say that over the last 10 years, when the government spent money on health, did that spending change the KPI for health? Did it change it for education, etc.? Well, it turns out that most governments never have enough money to do everything in that table. And the KPIs over the last 10 years have not improved, mostly because the government's Ministry of Health or Ministry of the Environment, however it's set up organizationally, will think that they're the ones that can spend the money just to achieve that. when in fact the intersectionality of I call them adjacencies, of the other quality of life elements is what can drive the cost up or down. Sustainable resiliency is in effect a credit score where what is the likelihood, given the last 10 years of spending money on these QOLs, that the next 10 years will see a 10% improvement in every cell in the table. This uses portfolio theory for how people would invest to achieve a certain return of their portfolio, but it applies it to quality of life elements. And the quality of life elements aren't named by someone who doesn't control the budget. By naming them and tracking them and monetizing them according to the budget, you know the actual market price to make a change in the health or the environment or whatever other quality of life element you're choosing. This lets us issue sustainable resiliency trademark bonds if we want, eventually. Why is all of this an explanation of the bank? Because it is. Imagine a banker listens to a borrower come in and she hears a proposal for a project or a business. Now, if you listen carefully, and bankers are not good at listening traditionally, they need to be better at listeners. They're good talkers. So she can listen. Oh, I hear in the story of this business how Harsha would change the health or the environment or the human rights or whatever the elements are that the government otherwise is spending an awful lot of money to achieve. But likely the rate of change that you can achieve at the private side scale is far cheaper to achieve per 100,000 people who are affected than when the government organizes to do it. So suddenly I can underwrite, I can do diligence, and I can reward in the pricing of the loan the contribution that a business actually makes to these quality of life elements. And we can standardize that not in some mythology that the SDGs are, but the actual budgeting that the place that you're affecting has. So I hope that makes sense. The other thing is that when a bank makes loans that are valuable in the real economy, as changing the quality of life elements is, those loans will always be repaid or virtually always be repaid because they are such a factor in that real economy, as opposed to virtual and other, derivative economies.
It's very interesting, and we do look forward to seeing what is the future of the bank when it listens more and talks less.
This is why I'm at Stanford, to teach who would I hire as a banker, Harsha. I can't necessarily hire bankers who were trained at banks where you don't listen carefully.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a very, very, very interesting and insightful feedback. I'm sure the ones listening would definitely take it. And so, moving on to the next question, much has been written on whether ESG can lead to sustainable finance. As the concepts and terms of sustainable finance keep evolving, what trends do you anticipate? As I mentioned, we would like to know what is the future.
Well, I actually do have a crystal ball. It's in the other room, but I didn't bring it into this conversation, and I'm probably not qualified to use it. I think sustainable finance needs to be as authentic as it can be to proving why it achieved impacts that mattered. There is now, let us say, I call it vanity metrics or vanity investing or vanity finance, where the person who is the investor or the fund says, I think everybody should have solar roofs on their houses, which is a thing. You could do that. But if the neighborhood that the house is in is has a lot of crime, and the people don't have a lot of education, and they don't have a lot of economic opportunity, the solar roof on the solar panel on the roof will be taken down, sold, and the people will not have solar roofs, and they certainly will not have better quality of life. So I think there's a humility, a humbleness for sustainable finance that it needs to practice, much like clinicians. The best doctors are going to be, in effect, very humble. They're not going to whip out the scalpel and start hacking at your brain. You know, they're gonna try to see, why is this patient presenting with these symptoms. So sustainable finance needs to be much more humble, much more clinical, much more transparent as to whether its impacts were achieved, and what the rate of return is. There is greenwashing, as you know. People like to claim they are holy before they are, and that can attract lots of investments, and they can have many parties during the holiday season at very fancy places like museums. But I would also suggest that there's a feedback loop needed for the people who are affected by the finance. And for that, I proposed a three-layered map of the world. So the first layer would be the needs. What do people actually need where they live? That we can get somewhat off the periodic table that I described. The capacities to fulfill those needs. Often there are many ways to get to clean water or clean air or other quality of life elements. Too often, those capacities are dictated by the third layer, which is the money layer. So needs, capacities, money. The parties that are responsible for appropriating the money into the money layer, let's say they are vendors of a government, or they could be nonprofits or for-profits. They will say, well, the capacity that I deliver is what's needed to address the needs layer, without consulting and having the direct participation of the citizens, the residents of the place you're trying to improve. Well, the people, if they live in Goa, and you ask the people of Goa how to spend all that money in the money layer, they might come up with a different set of priorities. And they might come up with a way to make much more and better use over the long term and short term of the money that's available to address the sustainable resiliency issues that we talked about earlier.
I'm sure there is a lot of implementation that would be done in your future, and innovative solutions would come into picture. Now, when we talk about sustainability and ESG, it's mostly focused on climate change and climate tech. Uh, but you are also affiliated with Stanford's Center for Human Rights and International Justice,
Mm.
which is of very paramount importance. You are a member of the Peace Engineering Consortium with other universities. Two major wars are going on: Ukraine and Israel. You were at the command center at New York City after the World Trade Center attacks of September 11, 2001. What could prevent future warfare or allow for peace afterwards, considering these two wars going on some major parts of the world?
Well, I wish I had that answer, especially at 7 in the morning. But I do wake up every morning trying to work on a piece of that answer. The Peace Engineering Consortium that I'm part of with the University of New Mexico, Drexel University in Philadelphia, George Mason University in DC, University of Colorado at Boulder, and one or two others. We're asking the question of ourselves. We know how to engineer systems that manufacture war. Are we smart enough to use the same engineering principles to reduce the likelihood of war, but also to improve what would otherwise be the poor state of affairs post-war? How do we rebuild after a war? It's in the early stages of that. We're talking about writing a book on that. Suffice it to say, I think finance has a large role to play in either perpetuating warfare or tamping it down. Sadly, war can be too profitable for some, and can perpetuate that. The I am just emotionally and genetically tied to both places. My father's family fled Donetsk in the Ukraine, and I've visited Israel many times, and I have family there who are safe, thank goodness. So it's a hard time emotionally, honestly, for many of us, not just Jews but others. The what is important, I think, in evaluating the amount of money that goes into war. I did a survey, and it turns out that 92% of the time since 1777, the United States has been at war. 92% of the time. And the amount of money we have spent, I could pull up the numbers, but it's trillions. It's trillions of dollars. How do you repurpose some of that is a good question. Sustainable finance and sustainability ought to be able to work on that as part of the my mother's family actually, I think, well, they came from Amsterdam, but before Amsterdam, they came, we think, from Portugal and Spain after the Inquisitions of the late 1490s. So on both sides of my family, I have refugee heritages. And so I can understand that migration is a responsible choice for people fleeing oppression. And they have to flee that oppression. How do we take them in? This is a question I am working on as part of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. Another part, which kind of shocks me as a lawyer, is that it seems that the international legal system does not have the equivalent of what we would have in the U.S., a criminal seizure. Meaning if you have a war crime, can the war criminal's assets be seized, be taken? That's something that we could fix. So as to say to oligarchs and authoritarians that you will not be able to keep the assets that you acquire by starting wars or propagating terrorism. So those are a few things.
That's very interesting, and I hope you get an answer of how we can repurpose the finances in sustainable finance instead of war finance in time.
Yes, I hope so too. Um, at least let's call it out. At least let's call out how these expenses of war are not going into productive use, right?
Yes, yes, indeed. Now, considering you've seen the vulnerable sections of society as well, and you've been through the refugee areas. At the design school, you co-created a course for people in the vulnerable regions affected by natural and man-made disasters. as natural disasters will become more frequent and more severe, as we just seen in Mexico yesterday. Please share what key points can banks or regulators or corporates consider to rehabilitate those people who are affected in these vulnerable regions. Because although the government claims that they've given many amenities, but still reaching to the end beneficiary is usually a question. So, how do we ensure that that happens?
It's a good question, Harsha, because as you point out, we have climate change to deal with. We also have fragile infrastructure in our urban cities. It's estimated, what, 50% of humanity by at least 2050 will live in these cities. If they live in the cities, they will live also in the slums that are around those cities. So when you think about a natural disaster, the natural disasters affect the vulnerable more than the middle class, let us say. And because the land that the vulnerable are allowed to live on is typically the worst land. Take Istanbul, where people live along the earthquake fault lines, and there's constant earthquakes. We will have more regions that are vulnerable. And so how do you rebuild in a way that can sustain or take the shock of those extreme weather or other events? We do have design engineering that can address that. It costs a little extra, but not a ton extra. And so you have to finance that resilience, which is why I use the term sustainable resiliency, because you can't just have sustainability without the resiliency to be a good investor. The course that we started with at the design school, we call it the D School at Stanford, was redesigning post-disaster finance. Because again, after an event, a shock, an earthquake or a flood or wildfires, a lot of money is appropriated and a lot of hands are in that money. So you would like that money to be, first of all, accountable, transparently accountable. Who did it go to and what did they do with it? But you'd also like the resulting infrastructure, the houses that they rebuild, etc., to be insurable. I mean, if you build a house in a place that just had a wildfire and you can't get insurance, as is the case with some communities in California, is that an economically viable asset? It probably is not. So as part of the course, we came up with some ideas. We suggested to a reinsurer, Munich Reinsurance in Germany, how they might work to create, in effect, an opted-in zoning code. So building and zoning codes are typically not updated as frequently as the severity of risks are emerging. You would want some agreement of the people who own the land that was just affected by an extreme event to all agree that they can rebuild to a very resilient standard, not the 1970, 1980, even 1950 standard that's part of the building codes for that place. The building codes obviously are written with the help of and the influence of builders, and that's not necessarily the most resilient, right? Because they want to take shortcuts. And you have what's called grandfathering, where buildings that are at risk. So if you have a street corner, you have 4 buildings on each of the street corners of an intersection, and one of the buildings is not retrofitted to a high standard, it can collapse or carry fire or other risks to the other 3. So you need everybody to opt in to this. And when you do that, you can create an insurable portfolio of buildings. Um, so that's one of the things we thought about. There's another idea, design that I have with a good friend of mine, Trent, which we call Skybrella. But I don't think I'll talk about that here because I need everybody to sign an NDA to hear about
That's very interesting. And do you see that Sustainable Resilient Bank would be able to provide the solutions for this?
it. I think so. I think that you need a banker. I mean, coming back to the earlier part of the conversation, okay, I'm from Philadelphia, so we like to swear sometimes, and I've asked your permission to do that, but because we're live streaming, I'll be very polite. And you need bankers who give a damn, who care. You need let's call them ethical bankers.
Yeah.
And most bankers think that they are ethical, but they operate within a system that doesn't exactly let them be as ethical as they know they should or could be. And that's a shame, given the prominence of in the economy of banking. So we need a new heritage of banking, actually the old heritage that knew its customer really well and knew the goals of the community in which the customer lived and wanted to support that. Just, the bank that I'm looking to form would be, in effect, I call it a teaching hospital for bankers. One of my sons, Eli, is about to be he is a doctor. He's going to be a neonatal pediatrician for babies and moms. You wouldn't give Eli, or someone just coming out of medical school, full reign over a patient. You want them supervised. You want them to practice it to make sure that the lessons are clinically appropriate. But in banking, we don't really do that. We write off loans, and we never look at the loans that we wrote off to see what the problem is. We have all these bankruptcies of companies. Why did the company fail? Nobody wants to look at that. Don't show me that. Well, venture capital. 95% of venture capital investments fail after 5 years. Just poof, gone. So what do you learn from moving money to things that fail that help you move it to things that succeed? We need to be clinical about that. We need a bank where we ask really strong and self-aware questions. And that's what this bank would be.
Totally. That's very insightful, and yes, we also look forward for the success of the Sustainable Resilience Bank and giving all the solutions and maybe training the existing bankers to.
It couldn't hurt, Harsha. It couldn't hurt.
Indeed, indeed. Now we know that you're leading to bridge the knowledge gap in sustainability, and you're doing that really well. Yeah, given in Stanford too. How might we, as a young institute in India, upskill and build the future generations for building a sustainable world?
I love this question. I, you know, I get fascinated by culture. I get fascinated by the history of cultures. I really do. I've shared a little bit about my mother's family and the Sephardic Jewish diaspora from Spain and Portugal after they were kicked out of those countries or had to leave those countries. And they did go as far as Goa, as well as to North America and South America. I think your school has to rediscover a piece of what are the intergenerational values that finance and sustainability can reinforce. Some of those values may be a little outdated. I'm thinking about the caste system there. I think about the racism and sexism here. and elsewhere. Some of those values have to be held up to a mirror and asked, do we really want to be this? Is this right for people in the modern age? But when I look at India being able to put little robots on the moon, there's nothing India couldn't do to address the needs of its own people if it tried. But they could also be tolerant of different minorities. You know, they don't have to oppress the minorities, because it turns out that when you look at the history of innovation, as I have, and others are seeing this, that it's the diversity of the innovator, the person who was excluded from a system, that saw how to change that system that excluded them. And we see that in America with Black and Hispanic and indigenous and differently abled inventors who invented all kinds of stuff we use today, like GPS and color TV and Wi-Fi. So I think if you look at it as a learning institution, you ask yourself, well, what are the informal taboos? What are the informal customs that we need to change? Some of which were appropriate, let's say, in an older time, or were tolerated, probably never appropriate, but tolerated. But they're not right now. And what are we going to do to change them? And how does bringing for instance, the Sikh people into the discussion give us the benefit of their learning, their intergenerational knowledge, alongside, you know, the other cultures that make up India? How do we do that? How do we benefit from that? As a learning institution, you can ask that question, and it's the right question to ask, I think.
So, yes, now that you mentioned this, I'm sure you would guide us how to create that kind of course and content and curriculum, and maybe you would train also.
Are you recruiting me again? It's the best. It's the best offer in Palo Alto I've had all morning.
Thank you. What would be your call to action to all our viewers who are with us right now, or who would watch the recorded session?
I think realizing that you each have a piece of the answer, that we each have, I think, a piece of answers to important questions. One of the reasons that I thought to use the periodic table as a metaphor and as a framing architecture for quality of life was, you woke up this morning in your day caring about the quality of life elements you care about. And that's what you see as priority, as giving you purpose in the day that you've just had in Goa. I woke up this morning a little bleary with some coffee, but with a similar set of priorities, but maybe not the same. You know, I could emphasize some over others. We need to have the ability for each person to be that individual change maker with whatever portfolio of concerns that they cherish, that they can be the steward of, that they can be responsible in their own way for, as opposed to in what you and I see all the time in the topic of ESG or sustainability, is it's almost like the Hobbit, the tale with the one ring to rule them all. That if you don't believe, Bruce, in climate change, it won't matter that you solve poverty, because everybody will be dead. Well, no, I care about the poor people, I'm sorry. And so we shouldn't be arguing about why you care about what you care about and I care about what I care about. Each should have the full resources to say, in effect, they all matter from a portfolio theory point of view to achieve sustainable resiliency, which would be a 10% improvement across all the quality of life elements. So we all play our role. Let's play our role really as a team, not to compete for resources and attention
Yeah.
and fame.
Uh, that's a great message to all our viewers. We've got a question from one of the panelists, Mr. Ashok. He's also a former Indian Army personnel, and he's asked how sustainability in finance can help small investors and startups, and what are the top three mantras to success.
Well, thank you for your service and thanks for participating, Ashok. Um, I I think we small investors are the catalysts for change, or small companies and small investors likewise can see a certain catalyst element that is missing. Um, I come back to what I said about diverse founders and diverse innovators. They're the ones, Harsha, they do it with almost no money. Because if they are a marginalized group within the society, let's take Black and Hispanic entrepreneurs and women, have traditionally not gotten a lot of resources from venture capital. So they're very innovative, not just in what they want to build, but how to finance it, how to do it. They do take sacrifice. One of the groups that it's an initiative that I have with Apple now is to grow a cohort of these entrepreneurs. I call them BIDers, Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, Disabled, and Underrepresented, BHID at URs. And what has happened in that group is that, yes, they are all at different points in their entrepreneurial journey. Some have been entrepreneurs before, some are newly. But in each case, they have an innovation that that a big company like Apple wouldn't necessarily have asked to be bid, to get bids to perform. There are some standard things that they're doing, but many of them are just unsolicited ideas for making things much better and much fairer. And when you see that, when you see that the small, in Jewish tradition, it would be the still small voice, that you listen to the still small voice. And when they speak, you should put some money at them, because first of all, the amount of money they're asking for in the scheme of things is very little. But it's also very powerful to listen to someone who's not part of a majority social cohort, and listen to them say, I want to change this. I have some stories I could tell, but actually, let me tell one story, because it's early in the morning. In the 1830s in America, there's a family with 12 children who are escaping slavery in, I believe, Kentucky, our state of Kentucky, in the South. And they escape to Canada. And they send one of their sons, Elijah, to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland to become a mechanical engineer. This is 1850, right before the Civil War we had here in the 1860s. He comes back. He's trained as a mechanical engineer. The only job he can get is throwing firewood into the boiler for the steam trains, and steam engines were the energy source for the Industrial Revolution, or oiling the locomotive or oiling the engine. And he realizes that the way that they lubricate the engines is not safe and is wasteful and could create harm. And he invents a different way and he patents it. Now, this is a former black slave patents this methodology. He goes on to patent many other things, including the ironing board and the ladder and some other stuff. His name is Elijah, I told you, and his last name is McCoy. And from then on, everyone who runs a steam engine, whether it's for a railroad or a manufacturing plant or for a steamship on the water, wants Elijah's system. Elijah McCoy is his name. They call his system the real McCoy. And that's where the English expression, wanting the real McCoy, comes from, is him. Okay? He's the one who saw how to make something that was dangerous less safer, make it safer. So listening to a small voice like Elijah matters. Of course, I love that story because one of my sons is named Elijah.
Well, that thank you for sharing that story. When you speak about the voice, Ashok ji would like to come on the camera. So he's joining us from Goa, India.
Hi, Ashoka. Hi.
So, thank you very much. That was very insightful and appropriate for us to understand your thoughts. So, coming from you, it's very important to us. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. You're kind. You're so kind. Thanks, Ashok. And as you hear, when you get to our age, you got to be purposeful in life, and you have to share that purpose as best you can, if it's hopefully a good purpose. And if we are at places of higher learning like Stanford or elsewhere, it's even more so, I think.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank,
sir.
thank you,
Very
sir.
appropriate. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you, sir.
It has been an honor to have this discussion on sustainable finance and life with you. And there is a lot beyond sustainable finance that we learned with this conversation. And the takeaway is huge. I must say that this is one of the best interviews. And thank you for taking time. And in time, I hope we all can use Sustainable Resilience Bank. I'm very much interested in it. I'll be one of the very
We have a simpler name for it, but I'll leave that for when we open it. So,
yeah.
but thank you for that, Harsha, and thanks for doing what you're doing there to try to create a place where the reality of sustainability, the role of finance can be much more clinically pure and ask itself, are we doing the right thing? And then improve by continuing to ask and answer those questions. So thanks for your leadership in doing all of that. I really recognize that and admire that.
Thank you so much. And you have a lovely day ahead. And namaste from India.
Thank you. Bye bye from Palo Alto.
Bye.